1915. For the soldiers on the Western Front, the new year brings stalemate. In the month since World War I began, the invading German army has failed to break through. Now it faces the British and French allies along a front line of trenches across France and Belgium. For nearly 4 years, these men will engage in the bitterest fight the world has ever known. These years will bring an appalling new weapon, poison gas, a new illness, shell shock, an extraordinary force, the mine. And these years will produce a new and deadly expression, going over the top.
It is a soldier's duty to charge against barbed wire into almost certain death. Often no one comes back.
If any man tells you he went over the top and he wasn't scared, he's a damn liar.
The trench warfare on the Western Front will bring unprecedented horror. And now, thanks to new computer technology, we will see it the way these men saw it themselves, in color. As 1915 began, the question for the French Supreme Commander, Joseph Joffre, and his British allies was how to break the stalemate on the Western Front. The German army was encamped in French and Belgian territory and facing the Allies along a 475-mile line of trenches.
You couldn't just stand there and wait forever. Something had to be done. The Germans, on the whole, were more or less content to sit there and say, okay, you move us, you kick us out, we're staying. And so it was up to the Allies to try and break through this great logjam. The essence of the Western Front War until 1918 was attempt after attempt, mostly failures, 1 or 2 successes here and there, to break that logjam.
The spring of 1915 saw the Allies' first concerted attempt to break the deadlock. But commanders on both sides were soon to be confronted with the hazards of trench warfare. One was communications, which initially were only possible through the courage of individual runners.
In the course of a battle, it is often necessary to send a runner with a message under circumstances which involve certain death or wounding. Yet never have I seen one of these carefully chosen men waver or hang back. No matter how dangerous the errand, the runner on duty never wants calling twice. He will pick up his rifle and be off, often to his death.
It might take hours for a message to travel little more than a few hundred yards. And that, of course, meant that by the time the general received the information and tried to act upon it, the situation on the front line had changed dramatically. And this is one of the major handicaps that commanders of the First World War had to contend with.
It was in this fog of war that the major offensives of 1915 began. The Allies devised a two-pronged operation to push back the Germans. The French would attack at Artois, while 20 miles along the line, the British would attack simultaneously at Festubert.
British and French High Command had come to believe that one more big push in the spring would break through the German trenches and reopen mobile warfare on the Western Front. But the battles fought at Festubert and in Artois in May 1915 simply showed that that was not going to happen, that the war was going to go on. And the British realised that their army simply was not big enough to sustain losses on this scale in this sort of warfare.
The campaign of spring 1915 took a devastating toll. The Allies suffered hundreds of thousands, killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. The British had traditionally had a small standing army. Their strength was in their navy. But the recruiting campaign masterminded by Lord Kitchener was producing a new mass of soldiers. To the professional soldier, these recruits presented an astonishing sight.
The British civilian had taken over the war. Many of the straight-spined old soldiers looked askance at the civilian warrior, and indeed the civilian under arms presented many a strange sight to our conservative eyes. He was undersized, he slouched, he was bespectacled. He wore uniform in a careless way. He saluted awkwardly and was very clumsy with his weapons. The old army was distinctly queasy about the future.
Kitchener's men saw their first significant action in September 1915 at the Battle of Loos. The aim, in collaboration with French forces to the south, was to break through German lines. But it turned into the standard pattern of battle. Artillery bombardment, followed by infantrymen going over the top, followed by slaughter.
The ground was sprinkled with dead and dying heroes. But we had no time to stop and look at them, and soon got used to those ghastly faces. Many lay as they fell, and one actually had a letter in his hand, as though he had managed to read it through before he died.
Loos was the first time a large British army took very heavy casualties in one battle, some 43,000. The British responded by appointing a new commander-in-chief, Douglas Haig. The slaughter on the Western Front had only just begun. As the war stretched into its second year, hundreds of thousands of men from different nations headed for the front line and its unfamiliar terrors. One dominated, going over the top.
It is utterly impossible to describe one's feelings during the hours waiting for 0 hour. The mind is full of wild thoughts which are utterly beyond control. Recollections of friends and dear ones, places we have seen and known, and different phases of life all seem to pass in review before one's eyes.
We lived absolutely from one minute to the other, not knowing whether it would be our last or not. And that was the atmosphere that we lived in the trenches.
They had to just wait and listen for the order, because discipline was so great that all they had to do was to wait to listen for orders and obey them immediately. And everyone was ready and waiting for the order to go over.
We must lose a lot more men, but the men are only too willing to take their chance. It makes me awfully proud to belong to a nation who, when they're warned for a show like this, knowing what it means, cheer and start singing and whistling.
I always said a prayer. You know that's something lads used to laugh at me. But I ought to ask God to let me fight like a man and bring back safe and sound.
If any man tells you he went over the top and he wasn't scared, he's a damn liar. Because you never knew from one minute to the next whether that dark angel was around with your number on a label.
The men being sent to the front were nothing without their weapons and the artillery that was supposed to support them. But the endless pounding was bringing with it a crisis of supply.
Before the First World War, the British Army was a standing army of only about 200,000 men. Now, our armaments industry was only geared up to provide uniforms, equipment and weapons for 200,000 men. In fact, when Haig takes command, he says, we will not be able to fight a major offensive action until the middle of 1917, because he knew that until then, we were never going to have heavy industry to provide us with enough guns and shells and the ability to fight that campaign any earlier.
The answer was a huge mobilization of women to work in the munitions factories. Handling explosives was unpleasant, dirty, and dangerous.
It was all bright ginger. All our front hair and all our faces were bright yellow. This doctor was looking at us all one day, and he said, half you girls will never have babies, God help you.
Some of them suffered very badly. They were known as the Canaries because the handling TNT, explosives, made their skin go yellow. Some of them really suffered appallingly.
Stained hands and coppery hair. What are these? Do we fear temporary disfigurement when men for the same cause are facing death, and not permanent disfigurement of maimed limbs or blinded eyes?
The munitions made by the women at home were the vital engines for their men at the front line. But their effect on the individual mind could be shattering.
I marvel myself sometimes how human nerves can stand the strain of our existence. Day after day, night after night, hour after hour, a heavy shell falling every few minutes within a few yards of you, shaking the ground beneath you, half stunning you with the crash of the explosion.
The barrage was so great that it deprived one of thought, really.
Shrapnel.
The barrage was so great that it deprived one of thought, really.
Shrapnel on the barrage was terrible, terrible. How anybody ever survived it, I don't know.
I picked up a piece of shell about 2 inches long, half an inch wide, jagged edge to it, right in the groin. The doctor came along and he said, would you like me to take that shrapnel out? And the pain from it was terrific. And he said, no, before you say yes, with no anesthetic in the camp whatsoever. And I said, how long will you be? He said, well, about 2 minutes. So I thought for a minute, I said, go ahead with it. And in those 2 minutes, I could have killed that bloody doctor.
These massive artillery barrages brought a new phenomenon: shell shock.
My leave from the front in the last days of 1915 was a nightmare. My sleep was broken and full of noises and voices of the war. The voices were those of officers and men who were dead. One morning I was discovered standing up in bed, facing a wall, ready to repel an imaginary dawn attack. I had a real physical pain in my heart. I had loved many men and lost.